Commander Olivia Dawson stood at the viewing window of the Earth exploration vessel Audacity, watching the stars. The ship had been traveling for 3 years on its mission to explore the outer reaches of the solar system and beyond. Dawson rubbed her tired eyes. After years of finding nothing but empty space and lifeless planets, she had almost given up hope of finding alien life. "Commander," Lieutenant Kevin Martinez called from his station. "I'm picking up strange readings at the edge of our sensor range." Dawson walked quickly to his console. "What kind of readings?" "Metal. Lots of it." Martinez adjusted some controls. "And it's moving." The bridge crew fell silent. Everyone understood what this meant. After centuries of wondering if humanity was alone in the universe, they might be about to get their answer. "Put it on the main screen," Dawson ordered. The large screen at the front of the bridge flickered to life. At first, there was nothing but stars. Then the computer enhanced the image and gasps filled the room. In the distance floated what could only be described as ships. Not just a few ships, hundreds of them. Some were massive, larger than anything humans had ever built. They gleamed, gold and silver in the starlight, covered in what looked like decorative patterns and strange symbols. Are those actual jewels on the hulls?" asked Navigator Frank Turner, squinting at the screen. Dawson leaned forward. The alien vessels did indeed appear to be decorated with what looked like precious stones. Their designs were unlike any human ship, full of unnecessary curves, spires, and ornamental features that served no obvious purpose. "Martinez, scan those ships. What kind of weapons are we looking at?" Dawson asked, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. Martinez worked his controls. "That's strange. I'm detecting energy signatures, but they're inefficient. Like they're using power for decoration rather than function." "They're hailing us," announced Communications Officer Diane Wilson. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked her station. "I'm receiving a transmission." "Put it through," Dawson ordered, straightening her uniform. The screen changed to show an alien. It looked somewhat humanoid, but with pale blue skin and large dark eyes. The most striking thing was its clothing, an elaborate outfit with shoulder pieces that extended several feet on each side, and a headdress so tall that the alien had to hold its neck at an uncomfortable angle to keep it balanced. The background showed what appeared to be a ship bridge, but it looked more like a palace throne room, with ornate decorations everywhere. "Greetings, primitive vessel." The alien spoke in surprisingly good English. "You are honored beyond measure to be addressed by Grand Admiral Zextillion the Illustrious, 17th Beacon of the Imperial Fleet, holder of the 12 sacred medallions of ancestral glory, chief conductor of the Imperial Symphony of Righteous Conquest, and favored cousin to the nephew of His Most Sublime and Effervescent Majesty, Emperor Krax the 98th. The alien paused, clearly expecting some reaction. Dawson blinked. Hello. I'm Commander Olivia Dawson of the Earth exploration vessel Audacity." The alien waited, but when Dawson said nothing more, it looked confused. "Your full title?" "That is my full title." The alien's expression was difficult to read, but it seemed shocked. "No hereditary honorifics? No ceremonial designations? No poetic epithets granted by your supreme ruler?" "No. We keep things simple," Dawson replied. In the background, Lieutenant Martinez made a strange choking sound as he tried to suppress laughter. The alien continued. "We represent the eternal and absolute galactic imperium of supreme excellence and unmatched majesty, rulers of 8,000 star systems and keepers of the sacred flame of civilization for over 20,000 years. We demand your immediate and unquestioning obeisance to our illustrious magnificence." At this, Martinez couldn't hold back anymore. A snort of laughter escaped him. The alien's eyes widened in what appeared to be shock. "Lieutenant," Dawson snapped, but she too was fighting a smile. "I'm sorry, Commander," Martinez said, not looking sorry at all. "But did they just say obeisance to our illustrious magnificence with a straight face?" The alien spoke again, voice stiff with what might have been offense. "You find our sacred ceremonial greeting humorous, primitive one?" Before Dawson could respond diplomatically, more aliens appeared on screen behind the first one. They wore equally ridiculous outfits, some with collars so high they could barely turn their heads, others with sleeves so long and flowing they had assistants holding them up. "Grand Admiral," one new alien said while performing an elaborate bow that nearly caused his headdress to topple. "The minor associate deputy to the Vice Chancellor of First Contact Protocols wishes to inform you that you have failed to recite the traditional greeting of benevolent intimidation, Section 4, paragraphs 12 through 18. The Grand Admiral looked mortified. "My deepest and most sincere apologies for this unforgivable oversight. I shall immediately begin the traditional 7-hour ceremony of formal contrition." By now, several members of the human bridge crew were openly laughing. Dawson tried to maintain her composure, but even she couldn't help smiling. "Perhaps we could skip the ceremonial parts and just talk," she suggested. The aliens looked scandalized. The Grand Admiral straightened his already rigid posture even more. "Skip ceremonies," he repeated as if the words were foreign. "That would be unprecedented, improper, possibly even efficient." He whispered the last word like it was obscene. "Well, we humans tend to prefer efficiency," Dawson said. The alien delegation huddled together, whispering frantically. After several minutes, the Grand Admiral turned back to the screen. "We shall consult the sacred scrolls of diplomatic precedent to determine if such an irregular approach is permissible," he announced. "This will require only a brief consultation period of approximately 6 standard days." 6 days just to decide if we can talk without ceremony?" Navigator Turner muttered. The Grand Admiral continued. "In the meantime, we require your vessel to arrange itself in the traditionally submissive hexaform pattern of respectful approach. We are transmitting the necessary 742 navigational adjustments now." When the transmission ended, the bridge crew of the Audacity looked at each other in disbelief before breaking into more laughter. "Commander," Martinez said, wiping tears from his eyes, "I think we've discovered the galaxy's most bureaucratic empire." Dawson studied the ornate alien ships on the screen. Despite their impressive size and number, she felt less afraid than she had moments ago. "You know what?" she said, settling back into her command chair with a smile. "Something tells me humanity is going to do just fine out here." 2 weeks after first contact, Admiral Carlos Mendez stood in the docking bay of the UN diplomatic vessel Handshake. He tugged at the collar of his dress uniform and glanced at his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. "They're late," he muttered to Dr. Susan Bell, who stood beside him. "Actually, they're precisely on time according to their ceremonial calendar," Dr. Bell replied, checking her notes. "The Imperial delegation insisted on arriving during what they call the hour of auspicious engagement, which apparently begins exactly 17 minutes after what would be the logical meeting time." Mendez sighed. "Of course it does." The assembled human diplomatic team had spent days preparing for this meeting. They had practiced the complex greeting ceremonies demanded by the Galactic Empire, memorized dozens of formal titles, and learned how to properly address aliens of various ranks. Despite all this preparation, Dr. Bell had warned everyone that they would probably still make mistakes. "Remember," she whispered to the team one last time, "no smiling during the procession of august dignitaries, 3 bows during the acknowledgement of infinite wisdom, and absolutely no eye contact with the Grand Vizier." "What happens if we accidentally make eye contact?" asked a young diplomat named Eric Powell. Dr. Bell shrugged. "According to their protocols, it's considered a formal challenge to the Vizier's authority, requiring either ritual combat or 16 hours of apology poems." "I'll keep my eyes on the floor," Powell replied quickly. A loud musical chime announced the arrival of the Imperial shuttle. The docking bay doors opened to reveal an ornate vessel covered in what appeared to be actual gold leaf and gemstones. Even the landing gear was decorated with swirling patterns. "That's not a spaceship. That's a parade float," Mendez whispered, earning him a sharp elbow from Dr. Bell. The shuttle door opened with a hiss and a small alien stepped out. It wore simple clothing compared to the Grand Admiral they had seen in the first transmission. This alien carried what looked like a musical instrument. "That's the Imperial announcer," Dr. Bell explained quietly. "He'll introduce each member, of the delegation. The small alien raised the instrument to its lips and played a series of piercing notes that made the humans wince. Then it spoke in a voice much louder than seemed possible from its small body. Prepare yourselves, primitive beings, for the overwhelming honor of being in the presence of the Supreme Diplomatic Adjutant to the 37th Echelon of Imperial External Affairs, bearer of the Sacred Chalice of Diplomacy, guardian of the 17 Scrolls of Proper Etiquette, and winner of the Imperial Flower Arrangement Championship 3 years running. The humans blinked in surprise at the last title, but quickly composed themselves as an important-looking alien emerged from the shuttle. It wore robes so heavily embroidered with gold thread that they looked stiff and uncomfortable. Its headdress was even more elaborate than the Grand Admiral's had been, with dangling ornaments that swayed with each careful step. The Supreme Diplomatic Adjutant was followed by a procession of 20 aides, each wearing increasingly ridiculous outfits. One had shoulder pads that extended 3 feet in each direction, forcing the aliens behind to walk at a careful distance. Another wore a ceremonial cape so long that 2 assistants had to carry the train. A third had a headdress so tall they were forced to duck through the doorway. Mendez bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. Beside him, Dr. Bell was taking slow, deep breaths. When the entire delegation had assembled, the Supreme Diplomatic Adjutant stepped forward with great ceremony. 2 assistants rushed to unfurl an actual scroll that trailed along the floor. The adjutant cleared its throat and began reading. We, the representatives of the eternal and absolute galactic imperium of supreme excellence and unmatched majesty, under the benevolent gaze of Emperor Krax the 98th, most radiant sovereign, of the 7 galactic spirals, master of 1,000,000 worlds, keeper of the sacred flame of ancestral wisdom. 15 minutes later, the alien was still listing titles and had only made it halfway through the scroll. Several members of the human delegation were shifting uncomfortably. Eric Powell appeared to be in physical pain from maintaining his formal posture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the adjutant finished reading the imperial greeting and looked expectantly at the humans. Admiral Mendez stepped forward. Carlos Mendez, Admiral, Earthfleet. We welcome you to our vessel and look forward to productive discussions. The aliens stared at him in shocked silence. That's all? The Supreme Adjutant asked, genuinely confused. No hereditary honorifics? No ceremonial appellations bestowed by your Supreme Ruler? No poetic description of your lineage dating back at least 12 generations? We're more of a get-to-the-point kind of species, Mendez replied with a straight face. Behind him, Dr. Bell discreetly pinched her leg to prevent herself from laughing. The Supreme Adjutant turned to its assistants, speaking in urgent whispers. The humans caught phrases like unprecedented brevity and possibly an insult and check the protocol scrolls. After several minutes of heated discussion, the adjutant turned back to face the humans. We shall attempt to adapt to your unusual customs, it said stiffly, though I must note that this breach of proper diplomatic etiquette will be recorded in the great ledger of historical improprieties. We appreciate your flexibility, Dr. Bell said, stepping forward. Perhaps we could move to the conference room to begin our discussions? Another round of whispering among the aliens followed. According to the sacred timetable of diplomatic engagements, the adjutant finally announced, we cannot begin substantive discussions until after the ceremonial exchange of symbolic gifts, the ritual tasting of friendship beverages, and the traditional 7 dances of peaceful intent. Mendez looked at Dr. Bell with raised eyebrows. How long will all that take? He asked quietly. Dr. Bell checked her notes and winced. Approximately 14 hours. 14 hours before we even start talking? Actually, Dr. Bell whispered, these are just the preliminary ceremonies. The real discussions aren't scheduled to begin until next Tuesday. As the Imperial delegation began arranging themselves for the first ceremony, Admiral Mendez leaned close to Dr. Bell's ear. You know what I'm thinking? He murmured. That any species that spends this much time on ceremony probably hasn't had a real war in centuries, she replied. Mendez nodded. Exactly. Maybe meeting these aliens isn't as frightening as we thought. Although, Dr. Bell added with a small smile. Surviving their ceremonies might be the real challenge. Captain Alan Grant stood on the bridge of the Earth defense vessel Defiant, watching the massive Imperial warship on the main screen. The alien vessel was 3 times the size of his ship and covered in what appeared to be ceremonial markings and gold decoration. Despite its impressive size, Grant felt oddly calm. "They're hailing us again, Captain," said communications specialist Lucy Reeves, looking up from her console with an expression caught between amusement and disbelief. Grant nodded. "Put them through." The screen changed to show an Imperial military commander. Like all the aliens they had encountered so far, this one wore an absurdly complex uniform with medals covering nearly every inch of the front. His headdress featured what looked like miniature model ships arranged in some sort of formation. "Attention, primitive vessel," the alien commander began in the now familiar pompous tone. "I am Grand Battle Coordinator Vexnar, Master of the 7th Fleet of Ceremonial Intimidation, bearer of the Sacred Warfan, and 14-time champion of the Imperial Military Parade Precision Walking Competition." Grant managed to keep a straight face. "Captain Alan Grant of the Earth Defense Vessel Defiant. How can I help you?" The alien appeared momentarily flustered by Grant's brief introduction, but quickly recovered. "We have observed that your escort vessels are arranged in a completely chaotic and aesthetically displeasing formation. This is unacceptable according to the 10,000-year-old Manual of Proper Space Engagement." Grant glanced at his tactical display. The 4 smaller Earth ships accompanying the Defiant were positioned for optimal defense coverage, not visual appeal. "What's the problem with our formation?" Grant asked. The alien commander sighed dramatically. "Everything. Where is the harmony? The symbolic representation of Imperial dominance? We demand you arrange your vessels in the traditionally submissive hexaform pattern of respectful approach." "The what now?" Grant asked. "The hexaform pattern of respectful approach," the alien repeated slowly, as if talking to a child. "It is the only appropriate formation for lesser vessels when approaching an Imperial warship of the Majestic class or above." Lucy Reeves spoke up from her station. "Sir, they're transmitting diagrams. It looks like they want us to spend 4 hours maneuvering into a flower-like pattern before we're allowed to communicate further." Grant raised an eyebrow. 4 hours of maneuvering just to talk? Apparently, each position change needs to be accompanied by specific thruster burns that they consider ceremonially significant, Reeves explained, scrolling through the transmitted data. "There's also a suggestion that we play something called the Imperial Anthem of Glorious Subjugation on all frequencies during the approach." Grant leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Tell them we'll just use the radio instead." The alien commander's reaction to this message was one of utter shock. "Impossible! No approaching vessel has ever refused the hexaform pattern. This is an insult to the Imperial fleet and all it stands for." "No offense intended," Grant replied calmly. "We just don't see the point in wasting 4 hours on a decorative flying pattern." While the alien was still sputtering in outrage, the Defiant's weapons officer, Steve Bennett, suddenly straightened at his console. "Captain, they're scanning us," he reported. "Specifically our weapon systems." Grant nodded but remained relaxed. Earth ships had been designed with practicality in mind. They weren't pretty, but they were functional and well-armed. A moment later, the alien commander's eyes widened in apparent horror. You carry nuclear weapons? And chemically propelled kinetic projectiles?" "Standard armament," Grant confirmed. The Imperial officer backed away from the screen, turning to shout at his crew in his own language. The bridge of the alien ship erupted in what looked like panic. When the commander turned back to the screen, his pompous demeanor had vanished. "You carry weapons of mass destruction on exploration vessels? What kind of barbaric species are you?" Grant was confused. "They're defensive weapons. Don't your ships have similar systems?" "Of course not," the alien exclaimed. "Imperial vessels are equipped with ceremonial light display cannons and traditional sound wave disruptors. Our ships are symbols of Imperial prestige, not machines of war." "Your weapons are for show?" Grant asked incredulously. "For 15,000 years, Space combat has been conducted according to the sacred rules of engagement, the alien explained, clearly distressed. Ships align in proper formation, exchange ritual warning shots aimed precisely 20 ship lengths from each other's bows, then engage in the traditional 12 maneuvers of battle ceremony. The side demonstrating the most precise execution of the maneuvers is declared the winner. Grant exchanged a look with his officers. You decide battles based on which side performs better in a flying exhibition? Of course, what barbaric alternative could there be? The alien demanded, then answered his own question. Obviously, you actually destroy each other's vessels? With real weapons? Grant nodded slowly. That's generally how war works, yes. The Imperial commander made a gesture that might have been their equivalent of crossing himself. We are departing immediately. Prepare to receive a formal declaration of your extraordinary barbarism, which will be filed with the Imperial Records Office. The transmission cut off abruptly. On the main view screen, the massive Imperial warship was already turning away, its engines glowing as it prepared to leave. They're running, Bennett said, sounding surprised. Can't really blame them, Grant replied. Finding out your ceremonial weapons and dance fighting won't work against actual weapons must be quite a shock. Later that week, during a scheduled war game demonstration, several Imperial military observers watched from a safe distance as human ships performed combat maneuvers. Unlike the regimented, showy patterns the Empire favored, Earth vessels moved, unpredictably, prioritizing defensive positioning and attack angles. But where is the honor in such tactics? Asked one Imperial commander, genuinely distressed. Your vessels move with no concern for the 5 harmonies of righteous warfare. Commander Patricia Winters of the Earth Fleet could only shrug. We generally focus on not getting blown up. The Imperial officers huddled together, whispering urgently among themselves. Their expressions ranged from horrified to fascinated. Finally, one of them approached Winters. We have been observing your species for several weeks now. You lack proper ceremonial procedures, you value efficiency over tradition, and your military tactics are completely devoid of aesthetic consideration. Winters waited for the criticism to continue, but instead the alien lowered its voice. Could you teach us? Teach you what? Winters asked, surprised. How to be effective rather than ceremonial, the alien replied, glancing nervously over its shoulder at the other Imperial officers. Some of us have begun to wonder if perhaps the Empire has become too fixed in its ways. Winters smiled. I think this might be the beginning of an interesting partnership. Professor George Bailey of Harvard University adjusted his glasses and tried not to sigh, as Imperial cultural anthropologist J. Nar asked what felt like the 100th question of the day. The alien was part of the first Imperial cultural delegation, sent to Earth with the mission to bestow the transcendent glories of advanced civilization upon humanity. What they found instead was a planet that challenged everything they believed about how societies should function. But who determines which aesthetics are permissible each season? Jennar asked, genuinely confused by a fashion magazine Bailey had shown him. Without a bureau of appropriate attire, how do citizens know what colors honor the Emperor? People just wear what they like, Bailey explained patiently for the 3rd time that day. Some follow trends, others don't. It's a personal choice. Jannar's large eyes blinked rapidly. A gesture Bailey had learned indicated deep confusion. Personal choice in clothing without Imperial guidance? Bailey nodded. Most aspects of human life involve personal choice. Fascinating, Jannar murmured, making notes on a device that looked more like a ceremonial scroll than a tablet. And do these personal choices extend to other aspects of life as well? Of course. Jobs, education, who to marry, where to live. Stop. Jannar held up a hand, looking overwhelmed. You choose your own spouses, without consulting the Imperial matchmaking registry and its compatibility algorithms? We typically find our own, partners based on mutual attraction and shared interests, Bailey replied. Jannar made more notes, his writing becoming increasingly frantic. This explains so much about human behavior. The chaos, the unpredictability, the alarming tendency toward innovation without proper approval from designated authorities. Bailey suppressed a smile. After 2 weeks of showing the Imperial delegation around Earth, he had grown accustomed to their constant shock at human society. The aliens were scandalized by democracy. You let the uninitiated masses select your planetary coordinator. Baffled by humor, deliberate linguistic misdirection is considered pleasurable, and utterly horrified by the concept of reality. Television. You document common citizens and celebrate their indignities for entertainment. But nothing confounded them more than casual conversation. Bailey led Jannar to the university cafeteria, where students were chatting, laughing, and eating together. This is a common social activity, Bailey explained. People gather to eat and talk. Jannar studied the scene with scientific interest. I see. And which formal conversation protocols are they following? None, Bailey replied. They're just talking. Jannar's eyes widened. Without protocols? But how do they know who speaks first? How do they determine the appropriate topics based on their relative social standings? Before Bailey could answer, a young student approached their table. Hey, Professor B, how's it going? The student asked with a casual wave. Jannar nearly fell out of his chair at this greeting. The alien had spent weeks studying human language, but the concept of informal speech patterns was apparently still shocking. I'm well, Ryan. Thanks for asking, Bailey replied normally. After the student left, Jannar leaned forward urgently. That young human addressed you without listing your titles or performing any greeting rituals. And he shortened your name to a single letter. In the Empire, such familiarity with an educational authority would result in immediate enrollment in a 40-day course on proper address protocols. Bailey smiled. We have a more relaxed approach to social interaction here. Later that day, Bailey took Jannar and the other Imperial scholars to a public park. Children ran freely, playing games with no apparent rules. Adults sat on benches, reading or talking without any ceremony whatsoever. A group of teenagers was playing music loudly, while others danced without following any formal patterns. This is anarchy, whispered one Imperial scholar, clutching her ceremonial notebook tightly. This is a Tuesday afternoon, Bailey replied. Jannar was studying a group of children who were arguing over the rules of their game. They are creating their own protocols without consulting authorized rule makers. Kids do that all the time, Bailey said. Making up games is part of being a child. In the Empire, all games have had fixed rules for thousands of years, Jannar explained. The Imperial Game Regulation Committee ensures that all recreational activities promote proper values and respect for tradition. The Imperial delegation became even more distressed when Bailey took them to a small art gallery featuring experimental works. But these images do not conform to the classical forms, exclaimed the Imperial art assessor, examining an abstract painting with horror. Where is the mandatory portrait of the ruler? Where are the 17 approved symbolic elements? Art on Earth is about expression, not rules, Bailey explained. Artists are free to create whatever they want. Whatever they want, the art assessor repeated weakly, needing to sit down. By the end of the day, the entire Imperial delegation appeared exhausted from cultural shock. They gathered in their temporary quarters, which they had redecorated with elaborate Imperial hangings and ceremonial objects to make themselves more comfortable. Jannar called for Bailey's attention. Professor, after careful observation, our delegation has reached a preliminary conclusion about human society. And, what's that? Bailey asked. Your species appears to be in a state of complete cultural chaos, Jannar announced. You have no unified aesthetic standards, no proper ceremonial protocols, no central authority dictating appropriate behaviors and thoughts. That's true, Bailey agreed. And yet, Jannar continued, sounding puzzled. Despite this lack of proper structure, you have somehow managed to build a functioning global civilization with impressive technological achievements. Bailey nodded. Freedom and creativity often lead to innovation. The aliens exchanged glances, clearly struggling with this concept. There is one more thing we do not understand, Jannar said after a moment. All Imperial citizens are assigned A happiness level each month by the Bureau of Appropriate Emotions. What authority tells humans how happy they should be? We just feel however we feel, Bailey replied. Emotions aren't regulated. This seemed to be the most shocking revelation of all for the Imperial delegation. They huddled together, whispering, urgently in their own language. Finally, Jannar turned back to Bailey. Professor, would it be possible? That is, could we perhaps observe more of this freedom concept? He asked hesitantly. For scientific purposes only, of course. Bailey smiled. Of course, what would you like to see next? Jannar glanced nervously at his colleagues before answering. We have heard rumors of something called a food court, where humans can select their own meals without proper nutritional guidance. This seems both terrifying and oddly appealing. Food court it is, Bailey agreed, noticing with interest that several of the aliens were now attempting to loosen their ceremonial collars when they thought no one was looking. 6 months after first contact, the Galactic Empire found itself in an unprecedented situation. The strange, informal humans, who had at first seemed like primitive barbarians, had inadvertently upended the galactic status quo. Imperial trade guilds were in chaos as human merchants bypassed centuries of traditional negotiation rituals with direct offers that saved months of ceremonial haggling. Several younger Imperial worlds had already begun adopting Earth-style direct communication, causing panic among traditionalists. Emma Walsh, newly appointed Earth ambassador to the Galactic Empire, sat in the massive Imperial reception hall, trying not to stare at the ceiling, which was covered in what appeared to be actual precious gems. She was waiting to meet with Imperial High Chancellor Zexatillion, whose 16-foot-tall ceremonial hat had been slightly downsized to a mere 12 feet after human influence made practicality unexpectedly fashionable. A series of musical chimes announced the Chancellor's arrival. 20 ceremonial guards entered first, followed by various officials carrying scrolls, symbolic objects, and in one case, a small potted plant that had some important ceremonial meaning Walsh couldn't remember. Finally, the Chancellor himself entered the hall. Walsh noticed something interesting immediately. While the Chancellor still wore the traditional oversized hat and ornate robes, they seemed slightly modified. The sleeves were shorter, allowing him to move his arms more freely, and the robe appeared to have, most shocking of all, pockets. Greetings, Ambassador Walsh, the Chancellor said, performing only a brief version of the traditional Imperial greeting rather than the full 15-minute ceremony that would have been required 6 months ago. Greetings, High Chancellor, Walsh replied with a respectful nod. Thank you for meeting with me today. The Chancellor settled into his enormous throne, which was decorated with scenes depicting the glory of the Empire. Walsh noticed that he sat with slightly less rigid posture than Imperial protocol would normally demand. Our ancient and most splendid Imperial Council of Resplendent Wisdom, the Chancellor began, then paused and sighed. The Council has determined that perhaps certain adaptations to our protocols might be beneficial. Walsh nodded encouragingly but remained silent, a technique she had found effective when dealing with Imperial officials who were used to long, flowery speeches. Furthermore, the Chancellor continued, looking slightly pained. Several Imperial worlds have petitioned to establish what they call simplified communication channels based on your human methods. That sounds practical, Walsh replied. The Chancellor winced at the word practical, which had become increasingly popular throughout the Empire in recent months. You may not fully understand what is happening, Ambassador, he said, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone except for the ceremonial guards who were trained to pretend they couldn't hear anything. For 20,000 years, the Empire has maintained stability through ceremony and tradition. Our elaborate protocols and procedures weren't merely decorative, they were the foundation of our authority. Walsh nodded. And now that foundation is being questioned because of human influence. Precisely. The Chancellor adjusted his enormous hat, which was tilting slightly to one side. Younger Imperial citizens are now asking why ceremonies need to be so long, why ships need to be so ornate, why communication needs to be so formal. They're using words like efficient and straightforward and practical All concepts that have spread like a virus since we encountered your species. Walsh tried to look sympathetic, but it was difficult not to feel a bit proud. Humanity hadn't set out to change the Empire, but their natural directness had proven surprisingly influential. What the Council fails to understand, the Chancellor continued, is why Imperial citizens find human ways so appealing. Our civilization has existed for millennia. Our ceremonies are rich with history and meaning. Why would anyone prefer your simplistic approaches? Walsh thought for a moment before answering. Perhaps because freedom is appealing. The ability to speak directly, to make personal choices, to focus on function over form. These things give people more control over their own lives. The Chancellor's expression suggested he had never considered this perspective before. Freedom to choose is more valuable than correct ceremonial form? For humans, yes, Walsh replied, and apparently for some of your citizens as well. The Chancellor fell silent, contemplating this idea. Finally, he straightened in his throne. The Imperial Council has drafted a new trade agreement, he said, gesturing to an aide who rushed forward with a massive scroll. The traditional version would be 6,000 pages of properly formatted ceremonial language. The aide began to unroll the scroll, which stretched across the entire hall. However, the Chancellor continued, raising a hand to stop the aide. We have also prepared this. He reached into one of his new robe pockets and pulled out a much smaller document, perhaps 50 pages thick. This contains the same agreement but written in what our diplomats are calling human direct style. It contains only the actual terms of the agreement without the traditional 16 chapters of honorifics and the customary poetry sections. Walsh accepted the smaller document with a smile. This is a significant adaptation on your part, Chancellor. I'm impressed. Yes, well, the Chancellor said, looking slightly embarrassed. The Council calculated that we spend approximately 63% of all Imperial resources on ceremonial matters. Some younger Council members suggested that perhaps some of these resources could be directed toward more practical concerns. That seems reasonable, Walsh replied. Reasonable, the Chancellor repeated, as if testing the word. Another concept that has become distressingly popular. As Walsh signed the simplified trade agreement, she reflected on humanity's accidental diplomatic revolution. The Empire wasn't evil, just ridiculously formal and inefficient, trapped in traditions no one had questioned for millennia until humans came along and simply laughed at them. On the Chancellor's desk sat a human gift, a coffee mug reading Galaxies, most bureaucratic empire, which would have been grounds for execution months earlier but now served as a reluctant symbol of imperial adaptation. There is one more matter to discuss, the Chancellor said after the agreement was signed. The Imperial Fashion Council is in turmoil. Several Imperial citizens have been seen wearing what they call pants. Walsh tried not to smile. Pants are practical. So they claim, the Chancellor replied, looking troubled. But pants have never been part of proper Imperial attire. Ceremonial, robes and ornamental leg coverings are our tradition. Perhaps traditions can evolve, Walsh suggested gently. The Chancellor sighed heavily, causing his hat to tilt again. Perhaps. But if citizens can choose their own clothing without proper authorization from the Bureau of Appropriate Attire, what will they want to choose next? Their own occupations? Their own spouses? Their own forms of entertainment? Possibly, Walsh agreed. The Chancellor looked at her with a mix of horror and fascination. How does your society function with so much choice? It's messy sometimes, Walsh admitted, but it works better than you might think. As their meeting concluded and Walsh prepared to leave, the Chancellor leaned forward slightly. Ambassador, he said quietly, these new pants, are they truly more comfortable than ceremonial robes? Walsh smiled. Much more comfortable, especially for sitting. The Chancellor glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then whispered, Perhaps you could arrange for a pair to be delivered to my private chambers. For cultural research purposes only, of course. Of course, Walsh replied seriously. I'll see to it personally. As she left the Imperial Palace, Walsh couldn't help but smile. Across the galaxy, humans continued doing what they did best, cutting through nonsense, ignoring pageantry, and getting things done, while trying very, very hard not to laugh out loud at their new Imperial friends.